My name is Jen Carlo, and I'm the program manager here at Patient Choices Vermont. And Exit Matters is one of the really fun and awesome parts of my job, talking to different people every month on such interesting topics. So she's off camera, but we do have another PCV person here, Alia Salem, who is just going to help with a little technology if and when we need it. And I will introduce our speaker, Zeena, a little bit more formally after I do my beginning presentation. So let me get started on that so we can leave lots of time, I should say, for Zeena's presentation. All of our Exit Matters sessions start with me giving a very brief presentation on medical aid in dying and Act 39 in Vermont so that we can share that information on a regular basis with folks who perhaps can't make it to one of our in-person programs, and we're happy to be able to do that. Patient Choices Vermont was founded in 2002 by a couple named Dick and Ginny Walters. They knew that Oregon had, at the time, medical aid in dying and felt that Vermont should have that as well. They figured it would take 2 or 3 years, and actually it took 11 years of persistence and advocacy and grassroots work, but Act 39 was passed in 2013. And that legalized medical aid in dying in Vermont. And since then, PCV has worked to safeguard and improve the law and to provide this kind of education and outreach so that people understand it. The law was amended in 2022 to allow for telemedicine at the doctor's discretion. And the big amendment came in 2023, which was when non-residents were allowed to access MAID in Vermont. Currently, there are only 2 states in the country where MAID is legal that will allow non-residents to come and follow all the same processes as a resident would and meet the same qualifications and access medical aid in dying in Vermont. And for folks coming from out of state, all of the steps of the process must still take place in Vermont with Vermont licensed physicians. And we have a very small staff, and we're supported by several wonderful volunteers, a few of whom I see have signed in today. So that's wonderful. Medical aid in dying has a very specific definition, and I promise I do not read all the slides. This is the only one I'm going to read, I promise. But it's important because there are several different elements that we want to be sure get covered. So medical aid in dying allows qualified adults who are terminally ill and who are capable of making their own healthcare decisions the option to receive a prescription medication to be self-administered to bring about a peaceful death at the time of the patient's choosing. And it can only be accessed by qualified adults through a specific process. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And as we're going through all of this, I'm going to encourage folks to put questions into the chat if you have them, and then I will take questions when I'm finished with the presentation. The qualifications for medical aid in dying in Vermont are laid out in Act 39, and they're very specific. You must, of course, be an adult, 18 years or older. You must have a terminal diagnosis and a prognosis of 6 months or less, similar to hospice qualifications. You must have the mental capacity to make healthcare decisions, and that must be true all the way through the process and until the moment that you ingest the medication. You must be making an informed and voluntary request, and you must be able to self-administer the medication. That's another very important element that needs to be present when you ingest. And all of those qualifications must be met in all cases. There are no waivers or shortcuts or anything under Act 39. The process is also laid out under the law. You need to make 2 oral requests 15 days apart to a prescribing physician, and that 15-day period between your 2 requests to the prescribing physician is one of the safeguards that's written into the law. You also need to make a written request to the prescribing physician, and that's a form. It's on the Vermont Department of Health website, and it's also on the Patient Choices Vermont website under the Clinician's Guide. The form needs to be witnessed by 2 unrelated adults who are not going to benefit in any way from your death. They can't be They can't benefit from your will, they can't be members of your family, and they cannot be on your care team. And then you need a second physician who will confirm that you've met all of the qualifications and that you are in fact eligible for medical aid in dying. People have a lot of questions about the day of ingestion and sometimes are a little bit shy to ask them. So we share some information up front. About a half an hour before a patient intends to ingest the medical aid in dying medication, they will take 2 medications for nausea to make sure that when they do ingest the medication, it stays in their system. After they confirm again that they want to ingest, the patient will drink the medical aid in dying medication without assistance. And it's a compounded powder. There's 5 different elements in there, and it's mixed with a small amount of clear liquid and dissolved within that liquid. So it's about 2 ounces or so of liquid that the patient will be ingesting. The patient will fall asleep within 5 or 10 minutes and will not awaken again. They will just go deeper and deeper into unconsciousness. The time to death can be variable. About 80% of patients will die within about 2 hours, although it can be longer. And the physician's guide on our website lists some things that your prescribing physician should be aware of. In case it looks like perhaps the process will take a little bit longer, either because of the underlying illness or because of some of the treatments used to fight the underlying illness. Really depends on the digestive tract. So that's something to work with a prescribing physician on. The patient will be unconscious and will remain unconscious and will not know how long anything is taking, but it's a good idea to make sure that family and friends and the support folks are aware and know to expect that. We strongly recommend hospice enrollment for everyone, really, but particularly for folks who are seeking medical aid in dying medication. There are a number of reasons for that, including the support, the symptom management, and some of the other services that hospice can provide. But one very practical reason is if you are under hospice care when you take medical aid in dying, your death can be pronounced by a hospice nurse. So, medical aid in dying is always voluntary. Qualified patients can choose to pursue medical aid in dying if it is their choice. Patients can stop the process or rescind a request at any time. You can do that literally until the moment you ingest the medication. You have the ability and the right to change your mind at any time if that's what you choose to do. Healthcare providers, likewise, are never required to participate in medical aid in dying. And so one of the recommendations that we do make to folks who are considering this is that they start those conversations as early as possible with their physicians. You know, we suggest to people that you have that conversation with your PCP now at your next appointment, just to kind of start laying the groundwork and getting a sense if that might be an option for you, or if you choose to pursue medical aid in dying and you qualify later in life, if you will need to look for another physician. We have resources available to have those conversations with your doctors, which is not always an easy thing to do. So there are resources on our website. And again, we feel so strongly about recommending hospice enrollment that we put it on 2 successive slides because it really is important. Patient Choices Vermont website, I highly recommend it. It's packed with information. There's lots of good stuff on there. There's all of the description of the qualifications and the process that I just gave you. There's links to the Department of Health forms that you'll need, and there's more personal information as well. Some very generous former patients and their families have shared their own stories about medical aid in dying. They're up there. All of our past Exit Matters videos are posted on the website, as well as a website calendar that'll give you information about more programs to come, both Exit Matters and in-person programs around the state. There's a clinician's guide, there's news. We'd encourage you to sign up for our mailing list. We don't spam, we promise, but there's good information that goes out on a regular basis. So I'd strongly suggest that you check out our website. We have 2 other resources that I want to make you aware of. First, we have a helpline. There are 4 official Patient Choices Vermont volunteers who work the helpline, and they're wonderful, dedicated women who work about a week at a time. We hear from about 1,000 people every year. There's a form on our website. We occasionally get voicemail, but most of it comes in under web form, and people will write in asking for information, talking about their own particular situation, wondering if they qualify for medical aid in dying, what the process would be. And we found that when someone with a name, someone with whom they can communicate, reaches out to them to provide that information, that can be a real source of comfort to them, as well as a way to try to proceed. There's also a group of people called the Wayfinders. They're independent. It's a collaborative group, wonderful people again, various end-of-life experience. There's retired hospice nurses, case managers, death doulas who are available to help patients and their families. They do work with some Vermonters, but they work primarily with non-residents. As you can imagine, the logistics coming from out of state to access Made in Vermont can sometimes be a bit formidable. And that's a group who helps with that. And I will stop sharing now, and I will ask if we have questions, if any have come up in the chat, or if anybody wants to just raise their hand and ask questions now.
Jen, there was a question in the chat asking how does an individual from out of state start the process in Vermont for
Okay.
finding a physician and enrolling in hospice?
Okay. The first place you might start is to talk with your current physicians in your home state to see if anyone has colleagues in Vermont to whom they might refer you, or other contacts in Vermont. We have a very limited number of Vermont physicians to whom sometimes we can refer potential patients, but we always suggest that patients start the process with their own physicians and their own contacts. For an insurance company, I see it's not considered suicide. Under the law, your death certificate will record your underlying illness or condition as your cause of death, and the manner of death will be natural causes. This is not suicide under the law or in many, many other ways. So that's not an issue. Sorry, I bifurcated here. I'm looking at the list of questions in the chat. Enrolling in hospice, again, we would recommend that that you would be enrolled in hospice, again, in your home state for various reasons, and you can talk to them about a transfer or a travel depending on your circumstances. Physician-assisted suicide is unfortunate, and it's a phrase that's out there in the public discourse. We don't like it. We don't use it. We don't feel that it's accurate. It's medical aid in dying. But that is a phrase that we probably will not be able to retire completely. We'll keep working at it, though. I am delighted to introduce Zeena Regis. Zeena is with Compassion and Choices, and she will talk to us about having family conversations at the end of life, which is something that we field an awful lot of questions about and is a very important topic. So we are absolutely delighted to have Zeena with us today.
I am so happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Very, very happy to be here. I have spent the whole summer trying to convince my husband that we need to do the Vermont end-to-end tour. And he is a city boy, so he's not very convinced about that. But I've never been to Vermont and I would love to visit. And I'm also just a huge fan of Patient Choices Vermont. I work at Compassionate Choices, like Jen said, and one of my roles is working our helpline. We have a national helpline called the End of Life Consultation Program, and I so often refer people to Patient Choices Vermont. Just such wonderful information, a wonderful website, and so I'm so grateful for the work that you do, and I'm really happy to be here. Um, I was shocked when I was working on this presentation that Compassion Choices doesn't have like a deck already that like we work with because this is something that, as Jen said, comes up so often. And so work with me, y'all. These are to help me. These are things that have come up on the end of life consultation line. And I'll also tell you a little bit about my background. I worked for about a decade as a hospice chaplain in Atlanta, Georgia. That's where I live. And so these conversations always come up. And so I wanted to put some things together. So the slides are really to keep me on track. But I hope we'll have a good conversation. And I really want to leave a lot of time for us to talk at the end for questions and just comments. So compassion and choices, that's our little standard slide, improves care, expands options, and empowers everyone to chart their end of life journey. And we're a national organization dedicated to end of life issues. And so I wanted to start with what makes this conversation so difficult. And I'll start with a little story. Like I said, I have been working as a hospice chaplain for over a decade. And then I've been at Compassion and Choices for about 5 years. And one of the things, and I remember my father came to me and he had everything he wanted to talk about his death. And I've been doing this work for so long, but when he brought it to me, I was immediately like, absolutely not. You're going to be here for a long time. We don't need to have this conversation. I knew that wasn't true. Um, and actually, he came to me on a Monday, and his death was somewhat unexpected, though he had health issues. But he came to me on a Monday to have this long conversation where he laid out everything, which I'm so grateful for. And he died on that Thursday. And so it's like he knew, and he knew I was the child that had the capacity to in the facility to have this conversation, but it was still hard because we were talking about my daddy, and I'm a daddy's girl. We were talking about death, love, family, all of these things. So all of this, when we're talking, having these conversations about end of life, there are so many other things that come up. It's love, it's family, it's suffering, it's autonomy, it's friendship, it's grief, often all at once. We're having this conversation. And so, specifically, when we're talking about medical aid in dying, people may be responding to the idea of medical aid in dying, but also to the loss, the idea of losing someone they love, or both. So, all of that can be all tangled together. And then, as we know, and as a chaplain, I saw that old family dynamics enter the room alongside medical decision making. So, I know so many of us have heard the adage that funerals and weddings bring out the crazies in people. And so that's also end of life decision making. Like the conversations that people would be having right at the deathbed. It's like, oh, this is bringing up old wounds or old conversation or old things that are unresolved. And so just knowing that that's part of what makes the conversation so difficult. And so what can be helpful is all of us spending time with ourselves, defining our priorities and values. So thinking about what makes a good death, thinking about who you trust to speak for you if you can't speak for yourself, thinking about your identity, your spiritual practices, your cultural traditions, thinking about knowing that this conversation can happen in your own words. Also with your doctor, like asking all the questions. I know it can be really hard. In our current medical model to get all of our questions answered, but I am notorious for going in there with a typed out list of things that I need answered before I'll leave. But that can be helpful in defining our values and priorities. And just knowing that one of the bees in my bonnet is that we have often made end of life planning and end of life decision making a very solitary and isolated conversation. But I have found that people love to talk about it in community. I facilitate a lot of workshops, and I will throw out the question of what does a good death mean? And everyone has a story of a good or a bad death that they've seen, that they've witnessed, that they've heard about. And then I'll say, what does that mean for your own death? What do you value? And then the wheels start turning. But it's like I think that we often learn best from overhearing other people talk about their experiences. And so that I can throw out that question and then people have their own end of life plan by the end of the session or have begin to think about their end of life values and priorities. And so I think that is a wonderful place to start. I think so often we start with documents when it can be so important to start with our story and start with our own values, our own priorities, our own beliefs. And so, along those lines, starting the conversation for yourself, what does a good death mean to you? What are you most afraid of at the end of life? What kinds of suffering would be hardest for you? What does having some control at the end of life mean to you? And what would you want us? What would you want your family? What would you want your circle of support to understand if you become seriously ill? And so this is a great way to just think of it with yourself and then also to have that conversation with people in your family. So that sometimes that can be a great starting point. It's just talking about these questions in kind of an open-ended way before a crisis, before a diagnosis. And so along those lines, your first conversation about medical aid in dying may not need to be about medical aid in dying. Um, Sometimes it can be really helpful to start with an advanced directive and just that, like going through how that guides. So I said, don't start with the documents, but the documents can be really, really important. Often on our helpline, people will call and they'll want to access medical aid in dying. And one of the things I'll start with is, do you have an advanced directive or have you looked at the advanced directive in your state? Do you have a healthcare proxy? Those kinds of things. And that just gets us talking about there is medical aid in dying, but there's so much before that. So, like, what are the things that, um, what are your wishes and what are your needs, and who do you want that to communicate those things for you? And that can be such a great conversation starter for people. I often encourage people to start there. This is my advance directive. This is what I want. And I would like for you to be my healthcare proxy, and that's what this means. So sometimes an advance directive can be a great starting point. And also, and I love to just put this slide in there because I often meet with people who have this idea that, like, even though they know the person that they're choosing would probably not be a great healthcare proxy, they often have them because they're like, I know their feelings would be hurt if they were not my healthcare proxy. And so I often coach people around like, it doesn't, identifying someone as your healthcare proxy doesn't mean that like you love them the most or that you're the closest to them. These are the things to consider. Are they assertive? Are they comfortable talking about death? Do they live nearby? Will they respect my decisions? We also have an LGBTQ plus community toolkit that I just love to stick in there because often a question that comes up is, what about my chosen family? And what about my next of kin might not be the person. So I just find that that toolkit has wonderful, wonderful guidance, whether you're a part of the LGBTQ community or not, about what it means to choose a healthcare proxy, and how to best support and inform your healthcare proxy. And so starting early can be really important. Often on our helpline, we get conversations, family members wanting to have this conversation or having questions about it, which we really support, but it's right at the time of a crisis. And so they're engaged in the crisis. They're also trying to figure out the logistics. They have their loved one is in the hospital. They've just had a difficult diagnosis, or the client is in the midst of all of this. And so it can be just a really difficult time to have this conversation because there are so many other things happening. And so I really encourage people to make their end of life wishes a part of ongoing conversations about their values and priorities. One of our advisory council members, she talks about her father every Thanksgiving for her whole life, bringing out all of his paperwork, his advance directive, his post, his will, and wanting to have the conversation with the entire family at Thanksgiving every year. And one of the things that is very sweet about the story is his parents had died in their early 60s. So once he got to his early 60s, he was really like, I don't know how much longer I have. My parents died very early. I want to make sure that my family is equipped to have these conversations. The joke was on him because he lived to be 98. So she said, so she says, as you can imagine, we had all of these years of these conversations, but she said she was so grateful because when he did die at 98, they were so well equipped and their family it just had been so normalized about having these conversations. Her son would be like, her young teenage son would be like, okay, grandpa's going to bring out all of the things again. So just making our end of life wishes part of ongoing conversation can be really helpful and expecting it to be more than one conversation. I'm not saying you have to have it every year at Thanksgiving, but make just knowing that this is an ongoing conversation. And then what's also important is being clear about your boundaries when you're talking about this, having this conversation. What are you willing to discuss? What questions from your circle of support or your loved ones are you open to? What is absolutely not up for debate? And what support would feel meaningful through this process as you're putting together your plan, as you're getting close to the end of life? Thinking about those things can be really helpful as well. And when you're entering an end of life conversation with your circle of support, what are you seeking? It can be important to determine that understanding, agreement, permission, support, all of the above, and knowing that these things will change depending on the situation, depending on your where you are. But going into the conversation, um, just with this identified can be really helpful because it can be really disappointing if you want someone to completely agree and they do not. But you can also go in there and say, I just want you to understand what my decisions are, and I want to communicate them. All of those things. So just going through and deciding what is most important for you. And I just put this in there. This is something that we often coach people around and to kind of use in their own language, but I'm not asking you to believe what I believe. I'm asking you to hear and understand what matters to me. So kind of starting there, we don't have to agree, but these are the things that really matter to me. These are the values and the priorities that I hold, and that I want at the end of my life. I loved hearing Jen go line by line through what medical aid in dying is and what it isn't and what support you need. Because as so many of us know on this Zoom, misinformation changes the conversation completely. So families, loved ones, circle of support may enter the discussion with very different understandings of what aid in dying is and how it works. When I first came to Compassion and Choices, I was the director of faith engagement. And I would go into spaces where I've heard people are really against medical aid in dying. And I'm expecting it to be such a contentious conversation. And then I ask them, what do you understand about medical aid in dying? And I will find that it's completely off the mark. It is not what it is at all. And so, and then we have a very different conversation when I'm correcting the misinformation, when they're like, oh, okay, that's not what I thought it was at all. That's not as bad. And I know most of us on the Zoom know about medical aid in dying, but it's very fascinating to me to go in other spaces that where people are like, oh, I just thought you were going to kill grandma or whatever it is that seems so odd and strange. But it can be so twisted. So often misinformation can change the conversation. And so going in there with the facts and really what the eligibility looks like. And that's with anything, with VSED, hospice, whatever it is, but going into the discussion of with how it works. As a hospice chaplain, it was so shocking how often people thought hospice was a place to hasten death. And so I would often go and explain that no, that's not what hospice is. Let me tell you what hospice does. So misinformation can really change the conversation. A conversation that you thought was going to be totally contentious can be really different. Um, and when somebody is fearful or grieving, that inaccurate information can be really persuasive because we're already in crisis. And I also just want to say correcting misinformation matters, but information alone may not resolve a values disagreement, like if somebody just really is against it. And so facts and values are really different kinds of questions and conversations. So it can be helpful for us to just talk about like what are the facts? Um, who is eligible? What safeguards exist? All those things and the values. is this morally acceptable to you? What does dignity mean? What do we owe one another? How do I understand suffering? Um, it's very interesting to me. We often have a conversation ongoing at Compassion and Choices about this idea of suffering and how in some communities I work in, the idea of suffering is not persuasive in the sense of supporting medical aid in dying. Some faith communities really believe that Jesus Christ suffered, or some of the Christian faith communities that I talk to, Jesus Christ suffered. I can suffer as well. Like, suffering is not a bad thing. Suffering is to be expected. There's redemption in suffering, and so really, we find that that's a values different, and talking about that can be really helpful. And so, while facts can definitely clarify misinformation, they can't settle every moral, spiritual, and relational disagreement. But sometimes, even just having the lens to say, what are the facts here and what are the values and how they might be colliding can be super helpful. I also say listen to what may be underneath the words if someone is having a difficult time accepting your choices. Um, your giving up might be the language they use. And sometimes this can mean I'm afraid, I'm grieving, this is difficult for me. How could you do this to us is something that some of the people who call the helpline have will say that like that my family is saying, why am I doing this to them? And sometimes it can mean the feeling behind it is they're feeling powerless or left out of the decision making. That's suicide. Um, and we just had a great exchange about this in this meeting, but helping them understand how medical aid in dying works and how it's different from suicide can be helpful. Something we often hear people say their loved ones are saying is God decides when we die, you don't get to decide. But what may be underneath that is this conflicts with something sacred to me. This conflicts with something that I have always believed. And so this is taking me a little bit to wrap my mind around. Um, and I can't support this is something that people often hear, and that they may need a little clarity about what you're asking from them. And so this is a framework I use for a lot of hard conversations is listening to hearing the concern before preparing the response. Like, what are they actually saying about this thing? And clarifying, really asking what the person means, what they fear, and then asking, can I share with you my perspective? Can I offer you some information about this, about what I found? And then sharing. And then that just lets you know, are they willing to hear you at all? Or do they just want to vent about whatever this is? But that just at least prepares you for what that conversation may be. But then also sharing when you're given permission, share. This is the accurate information about it. This is the information that I got from Exit Matters and Patient Choices Vermont. And this is also my perspective on it. This is how I have come to see this thing. And then checking back and reflecting, asking whether you address the real concern, and then reflecting back on what you heard. And so it can just be a really good framework to say, we can go into a conversation expecting it to be hard, and that's how we show up. But sometimes just listening, clarifying, and asking and sharing and reflecting back can be a really powerful way um, to really get to the heart of the matter. Some of the coaching we have given people is just in conflict is I understand that you oppose this. Also, I'm willing to hear your feelings and questions, but I'm not willing to repeatedly debate whether my decision is acceptable. And also, space and a pause can be very, very helpful. We can take a break and return to this when we're both ready. And often, support does not have to mean agreement. Here are ways to be there even if you they cannot support your decision. So listening without debating, helping with appointments or practical needs, participating in hospice or caregiving, sharing meals, stories, prayers, ritual, quiet presence, and more than anything, being honest about what they cannot participate in and what they can participate in. So if there is a conflict, we want people to still be able to be there, even if they say, I can't support you with medical aid in dying, or I can't support you with VSED. These are the ways that I want to show up and make sure that I'm supportive of you. I also wanted to just offer, sometimes we'll get calls on the helpline with people who someone they love has used medical aid in dying, and they're looking for a space to process that. And so these are just some of the things that people have said. And I say there may not be answers to these things, but naming them beforehand can help. Um, Sometimes people will feel like I helped them die. And so there will be this grief tangled with the weight of having handled the logistics. One woman I spoke with said, like, I'm so happy that I was able to honor my mom's wishes, but I just cannot get over the fact that, like, I drove all these miles to get the prescription at a pharmacy. I called all these people to get help. And so sometimes as I reflect on that, I think, I helped them die. I helped my mother leave this world. And so one of the ways we worked on reframing that is you really honored your mother's wishes. Like you did a very honorable thing. And so just knowing that that comes up for some people. Some people feel that they miss sacred moments. They were so consumed by what had to be done that um that presence with the dying process slipped away. They weren't able to be present and really missed what they felt were holy moments. And then alienation afterwards. There are quite a few people who have helped their loved one use medical aid in dying, and their family and their friends don't know that's what their loved one did, and they felt some alienation, not able to speak of it openly because of some stigma and maybe because of some shame. Um, but talking through that and processing it. So, like I said, there may not be answers for these things, but I think naming them and discussing them beforehand can help. It can be a really great way to say, this, these things can come up. This is how do you want how do you want to move forward with this? And how do you want to counter them? Because this is what we're going to do. And so I just want to have some resources as we move forward before we get into the conversation, because I would love to hear your questions and what you'd like to talk more about. Um, but we have an end of life decisions guide. Um, I love, and I'm biased, but I love our end of life decisions guide. I feel like, and I will stick a link to it in the chat, but I find that there's a values worksheet. It can be very helpful in helping you get very clear about your values at end of life. And also, I encourage people to go through this with their healthcare proxy, their circle of support. Um, I think it can be such a helpful, it can be super helpful just to have something to guide the conversation. I've gone through it with my mother, I've gone through it with some of my other loved ones, and it just helps us really get on the same page when it comes to end of life decisions, and also helps make sure that we have the same definitions of things, making sure that we combat any misinformation about things, but like what are things and what is important to you. We also have a dementia values and priorities tool, and it's made as an addendum to your advanced directive. And it is shaped to think about what you would want your care to be if you got dementia. And I find that people really love going through it and using that as another tool to discuss with their circle of support and really getting clear on their values and the health care that they would want at the end of life. And also, I love the Death Deck. I just shout that out because Lisa Paul is a great supporter of ours. I work with her all the time, and she created the Death Deck as kind of a light and lively way to have conversations about end of life planning. I often use this in groups. I use this at dinner parties. It's just a great way to talk about things and to really, as we talked about earlier, kind of normalize the conversation about end of life planning. There's something about picking up a card, and I'm looking around because I have so many card decks that are end of life or dementia deck. But there's something about picking up a card and reading a question that almost gamifies it a little bit so that it can be not as intimidating. And so I have found that that's an amazing resource to get to really deep conversations really fast and really to talk about our values and priorities. We have a call compassion helpline that helps with resources. That's one of the things that I direct in our work together. So always feel free to call and reach out to us. And that is the end. So I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, thank you, Jen, for putting all of that in
Absolutely.
the in the chat. So I would love to know if there are any questions in our time together. I know I zipped through that, but I wanted to make sure we had some time.
Anne, please go ahead.
I'm one of those people that I ruined Easter instead of Thanksgiving. I kept thinking, no one's still practicing in the faith, but that idea of just the picking a time, and even though it might start with a little bit of humor in the beginning, it just sort of keeps everybody on track. We're a bunch of aging siblings who need to know what each other wants to have done, and so I, you know, the idea of every year touching base with it is something to think about. And I think now the one thing I think about more is um, over this weekend, 3 people in a circle of 15 people are facing new dementia diagnoses. I don't know how the plural of that is, but and that's something to me that sort of still feels a little bit elephant in the roomish as far as first steps when you first get that news. So thank you for encouraging us to all do our homework.
Yes, thank you, Anne. It is so funny. I often tell, especially Christian faith communities, to use Lent and Easter as a good benchmark to have these conversations. I feel like it lends naturally to the theology, and so I really encourage people to use that time. So I love that. Easter is a great time. I see Eileen's question. Can you speak to culturally diverse approaches to this topic? Yes, and that's one of my favorite things to talk about. I I think I mentioned, but one of the things that I often think about is that we do often start with the documents. I'll back up a little bit. When I first started at Compassionate Choices, one of the conversations we had a lot is when you look at utilization across African American groups, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, there's often this conversation about, and many communities of color, there's less hospice utilization, there are less wills, there are less advanced directives, and all of these things. So one of the things me and my team really talk a lot about is what can we lean into that's already happening? Because we know these communities are talking about death. I'm a part of one of those communities, and I know we talk about death and dying. And one of the things I just presented on this Sunday, I was in church one Sunday and I'm listening to all the hymns. It was after I'd started working in hospice, and I would hear all the time, we don't talk about death and dying. And then I'm like, no, we sing about it every Sunday. And so I have often used hymns and music as an entree into the conversation because we're singing about going up yonder. We're singing about swing low, sweet chariot, and all these things that talk about death. And so using hymns as a way to name it has been a way that I've been thinking a lot about um, expanding advanced care planning into arts and music. Using another way that we use a lot is documentaries or videos or movies, kind of as a way to start that conversation. Using stories of people in the community can be really helpful. Like what are movies or just artistic representations that speak to that. And so I have been doing a lot of that work and also getting movie nights together and that kind of thing to begin talking. And I just find that once you create a container, people love to talk about it. There were some faith communities that people were like, they are going to see compassionate choices and they are going to be like, you cannot come in here. But I've actually, when I speak to the clergy about this is what I'm going to do and this is what's going to happen, they let me in. And then we end up having a great conversation.
Lily has her hand
Oh,
up,
yes, Lily.
and then we
Yes.
have 2 others in the
Hi,
chat.
thanks. This is a hard question for me to formulate, so I'm going to do my best. I think it's to hear if you've had an experience. So dementia is a tricky illness because it may not be terminal for a very long time, and you may not want medical aid in dying because you have a dementia diagnosis, but you may want it. But there's a point at which you can no longer make that choice for yourself. And not only that, would not be able to administer the medication. So have you had an experience, like how do you work with that? That's very tricky, I would think. Yeah.
Yeah, Lily, that's a great question. And that's actually one of, I was just going through our helpline, just kind of charting through the categories of questions, and dementia is pretty much our biggest category. And a lot of our executives and leaders were shocked because they were expecting it to be medical aid and dying. That's what most people called about. And like it connects, but it's really like I've gotten a dementia diagnosis or somebody in my family has a dementia diagnosis. And so one of the things that I encourage, and I'd love to hear what Jen has to say about this as well, but one of the things that we encourage is using our dementia tools um, while they can still have a conversation about like where is the line in the sand with your care? Like what things do you right now, what do you not want? And while you can't do medical aid in dying, we can think about like down the road, what things do you want treated? What things would you not want treated? And we find that's a really great way to like start the conversation. And we had someone come to one of our programs in New York, and she shared that like her mother had watched her father have, just suffer with dementia for a long time. And so her mother said, I'm putting in my advance directive, like if I have an infection, I don't want that treated. If I have this, like all of these things that she did not want treated, I never want to go on dialysis. I never want this. I never want that. And so the woman was sharing, she was so grateful because her mom did go on to get dementia, but she was like, there were so many things that she didn't want treated, and it was written down that when I took it to the doctor was like, that's what her wishes are. We're not going to treat that. And so she said she was able to die a peaceful death because there were things that they just decided that they were not going to treat as she advanced in dementia. So that's one of the things that we encourage is that don't feel like you're powerless right now, or don't feel like your loved one is powerless. Like go through and really have these conversations.
So just one
I would,
follow. Oh, sorry, Jen. Just one
no, go
follow up
ahead,
thing.
Lily. No, go
What?
ahead.
So I guess then if you have dementia, if you've been given a diagnosis of dementia, but you're not able to request medical aid in dying if you have more than 6 months to live, is that how it goes? Even though you need to request it when you're of sound mind body. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Correct. There are any number of patients for whom that 6-month prognosis and their ability to make that choice and to self-administer the medication are not going to coincide. And so there are a number of people who will just not be eligible for medical aid in dying. And I will tell you that this is a topic that comes up at almost every public presentation I do. It's very much on people's minds and people's hearts. And I would encourage you to look. We did, April, I believe it was, a program called The Dementia Dilemma, When MAID is Not an Option. And so there's a lot of good resources there. We also frequently refer people to Compassion and Choices, dementia resources as well when folks write in on the helpline, which happens on a regular basis. And encourage people to have the conversations that they can have now about those end-of-life treatment decisions. It gives folks back some agency, and gosh, it gives their loved ones certainly some help and some guidance to go on. We do have a question in the chat from the other side of the equation. How do we speak with patients who may not have thought about MAID? One of the things that we say frequently is that MAID is one end-of-life option. It's certainly not the only option. There are any number of people who will never qualify for medical aid in dying, or who may not wish to pursue it for any number of reasons of their own. So it's important that all end-of-life options that are available to a patient be presented, and that they be given information and some support in understanding what the wide range of options or the narrow range of options might be, depending upon someone's individual circumstances, and MAID can certainly be included in that. We find that even in the states where it's legal, there are a number of people who don't actually realize that it's legal. So including it in other options that are available to them is, a fair and right thing to do, so that they understand everything that might be available to them. Zeena. Any suggestions on supporting people who helped family members in their MAID process, but because of family religious beliefs were asked to keep it a secret and are now living with a promise they have made to a relative who has left the world?
Mm, yes, Joshua, that's such a great question. I just had a conversation with a clergy person who's in a similar situation. They're one of their church members used medical aid in dying, but only shared it with the pastor who was there and present for them for the death. But no one else in the church knows, no one else in the family really knows about it. And so they've been dealing with feeling like this is hard. Like I know this dimension of this death that no one else knows. Um, but so going to a safe person who can talk about it, can be really helpful. There are also more and more MAID support groups, which I'm so happy to see that people are utilizing and going to. Um, just being able to talk with people who have been in a similar situation. We have a list that we send to people often who are dealing with this and want to have a conversation with it. Um, and sometimes I can be a little bit of a bad chaplain because I think that it's important to have, to keep that promise, but also it can be more important to share it with people that you feel comfortable sharing it with and that it's not a big shameful thing. It might be helpful for you to talk about it with people in your circle of support that would just receive that information. So sometimes secrets can be really difficult, whatever they are. So sometimes it can be helpful just sharing it with people that you trust and support. Even I'm not going to say regardless of the promise, but kind of regardless of the promise, because that secret can make us sick. And holding that if that's something that's difficult for you.
I'm just looking. I think we've gotten all of the questions that were in the chat. Deb, thank you. You also mentioned VSED, which is voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. That's something else that folks who have received a dementia diagnosis can discuss with their families. I added or minimal comfort feeding, which was a topic that was covered in the April Dementia Dilemma Exit Matters. It can be another option for someone who has requested VSED or for whom wants VSED, but because their thinking they've lost the mental capacity to really track that, they may be asking for food or drink, and that can be an uncomfortable situation. So again, I would encourage folks who are concerned about this issue to go and take a look at our exit matters from April, the dementia dilemma, and I've put the link to the page with all of our exit matters programs into the chat, and this will be up probably early next week as well, and you will receive a video from us with a link to the video of today's presentation.
Thank you, everybody. It was wonderful to be with you.
Thank you all very much. And I will say that Patient Choices Vermont relies on donations, as does Compassion and Choices. And so if you enjoy these presentations and would like to give us support, I've put the donation link in the chat as well. And next month's Exit Matters will be on water cremation. And the city of Vermont is one of the few states where you can do that, particularly in the Northeast. And in October, I'm hoping to work with some other folks at Compassion and Choices about the midterm elections and the political landscape for medical aid in dying. So encourage you to continue to watch for our upcoming programs. And thank you so much for joining us all. And thank you so much to Zeena for a wonderful presentation.